Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that John Quincy Adams rolled out the most ambitious presidential agenda to this point in American history, alienating him and chipping away at his support over his 4 years in office? And that an issue between the Creek tribe and the Georgia state government ignited a passionate debate about the doctrine of nullification and continued to lay seeds for Southern resentment. And that John Quincy Adams worked so hard and so tirelessly that members of his own cabinet couldn't keep up, complaining about how obsessive he was with his work. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 115, President John Quincy. Last week, we covered in detail the election of 1824. And this week, we are going to be diving into the presidency of John Quincy Adams. And I don't have any updates or book recommendations for this episode, so I think we're just going to dive right into it. As I had mentioned on episodes leading up to last week's, I had always been really interested in the election of 1824 and believed it was a pivotal election in our nation's history. Hopefully, now that you understand the backstory to it and have some more context around it, you can see just how much our constitutional stipulations come into play when elections become a bit unpredictable. This will not be the last election to have people scratching their heads and questioning whether the process that was set up in our Constitution is one that best represents the electorate. But we won't have to worry about any controversy like the Krupp bargain again for a while. What is also critically important about the election of 1824, which I didn't mention last week, was that this election will help to turbocharge some of the movements for political reform that had already been gaining steam during the era of good feelings and the subsequent fracturing of political unity. And that's something we'll cover more in next episode 116. And so some of the things we will cover this week and into next week, John Quincy Adams takes over as President of the United States, while Andrew Jackson begins to set his eyes on 1828. The reforms and changing nature of the political process over the next 4 years is going to, spoiler alert, help Andrew Jackson win the presidency in 1828 and see him riding a wave of reform-minded platform ideas. And his electoral victory will make him believe he had a mandate from the people to really shake some things up. But we'll get to that stuff in due time, right? Exactly what would he be shaking up? Right now, today, we're going to turn our focus to President John Quincy Adams. On March 4th, 1825, John Quincy took the oath of office. Adams knew that he was entering office under a cloud of controversy. He prepared diligently for his inaugural address, for he knew that the election of 1824 had exposed the end of the era of good feelings, and he likely felt, at least partially, responsible for it. And Adams felt the pressure, nervously trembling as he began to read his speech. Knowing that political division was something that would likely continue to plague him throughout his presidency, John Quincy Adams made sure to take his first opportunity to lay out his plan for the U.S. and try to alleviate concerns of his detractors. Adams took the oath of office on a book of constitutional law instead of the Bible, showing his commitment to the Constitution that his father's generation helped to create. In his inaugural address, Adams spoke about his desire to avoid partisanship and focused most of his attention on the domestic agenda of the United States. Adams had grown up a Federalist, but had split with the party over a couple major issues. But one of the ones he did have in common with them was a pretty liberal interpretation of federal power, especially when it came to supporting trade and the American economy. Adams again reiterated this belief, and as president, he was determined to turn his desires into action. John Quincy Adams spoke about an ambitious plan for internal improvements that would include roads, canals, and ports. They could go all in on doing whatever they could to help support the booming economy of this young nation, and he justified it by the general welfare clause of the United States Constitution. In this clause, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it says that the federal government has the power to tax and collect taxes for two primary reasons. Number one, for the common defense, and number two, for the general welfare. In Adams' mind, the internal improvement initiative that he was hoping to spearhead during his presidency was one that would be directly benefiting the general welfare of the nation. And with projects like the Cumberland Road and the Erie Canal already in progress, he seemed to have at least some decent justification. But even with these precedents set, Adams knew his plan was really ambitious, and that there would be considerable opposition to it. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story observed that, quote, "The address is very direct and unequivocal and will produce a great deal of approbation and disapprobation." And for those of you who haven't studied for the SATs recently, approbation means approval or praise. Because why just have one word that means these things? It's more fun to have a whole bunch of them. In keeping with his desires to be as nonpartisan as he could, Adams filled his cabinet with men from all regions of the country, with the two most notable being John C. Calhoun, his vice president, and Henry Clay, his Secretary of State. Like Monroe before him, though, Adams was not able to get his first choices at all his positions. Just like Clay had declined to serve as Secretary of War under President Monroe, Andrew Jackson and William Crawford both declined to serve in John Quincy Adams' cabinet as Secretary of War and Secretary of Treasury, respectively. While we don't know if Adams actually expected either of these men to accept, and he likely didn't, the fact that they were offered cabinet positions in the first place shows what seems to be a genuine interest in building bridges instead of burning them, an admirable quality for any leader. But still, the Clay appointment stuck in the craw of so many people, politicians and citizens alike. As you know, Clay's appointment was, quote, proof of the corrupt bargain. This was such a big deal that Congress even opened an investigation to look more into it. But that anonymous author who claimed to have inside knowledge of the quid pro quo back in episode 114, well, he refused to testify. So with that, the investigation ended, and Clay was approved as Secretary of State by a vote of 17-10. Now, what made matters worse in all of this was that Andrew Jackson was really angry, understandably, and he was not going to keep his mouth shut. After the appointment of Clay, Jackson made sure to let everyone know that he was offered the same deal with Clay, but he had refused because he recognized the corruption inherent in it. Now, whether that was true or not, who knows, but it sure did serve to rile up his base of supporters, and you can understand why. But to be fair to Adams, he clearly wasn't a brazenly corrupt leader. I mean, heck, he was pressured by Clay and many of Clay's supporters to remove numerous men who had appointments in the executive, but Adams refused, noting that if they were professional and competent, whether they agreed with his politics or not, or whether he owed them a favor or not, he was not going to replace them. This actually caused more issues for Adams, as many of Clay's allies had voted or convinced others to vote for Adams in the House election. expecting to receive some type of reward, same type that Henry Clay did, but to no avail. It didn't take long into Adams' presidency for him to be faced with a pretty critical issue. The first major issue that Adams had to deal with head-on was the dispute between the Creek Indians and the state of Georgia. Early in the 1800s, white expansion and settlement west had disrupted the Creeks, and as we've covered in this podcast, General Andrew Jackson led the offensive against him, earning national fame in the process, culminating with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. In case you don't remember, the Creeks then had to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which ceded a huge amount of land, approximately 23 million acres, which is most of present-day Alabama. Well, in May of 1825, tensions were on the rise again between Georgians and the Creeks. To essentially reduce down what was a very complicated story, a guy named William McIntosh, one of the prominent Creek chiefs, who was part Native American and part European, and he acted like it. Well, McIntosh had helped to negotiate settlements that gave up a lot of land to the United States, and then he stole much of the cash that the U.S. had paid, not him, but the Creek people. Then again, in 1825, in the Treaty of Indian Springs, McIntosh and others signed away even more Creek communal land, this time including specific stipulations that would pay McIntosh $200,000 personally. And now, like most things, no one knows for sure if he did that to personally benefit or to use it to distribute to his fellow Creeks later. But either way, it was very suspect. And the Creeks thought the same. By the time this treaty was signed and ratified by Congress, the other Creek chiefs realized what McIntosh and the other signatories had done by selling away their land without their approval. The Creeks actually sentenced the men to death, and about 120 to 150 members of the Law Menders, the Creek police force, raided McIntosh's home, stabbing and shooting him to death. William McIntosh's son, Chili, barely escaped and organized a trip up to Washington to plead his case and try to recruit help from Adams. So to set the stage here, Georgia has purchased an enormous amount of land, pushing the Creeks out of the state of Georgia and further west, and the Creeks do not agree that Georgia has purchased this land because they think it is null and void because of the corruption inherent in the negotiations with William McIntosh. So Chili is on his way up north to Washington, D.C. to try and help recruit some type of interference from President Adams, right, to stop the Georgians from moving west and taking the land. And making things more complicated and seemingly more corrupt, the governor of Georgia, the state that just greatly benefited from this treaty, well, his name was George Troup. George McIntosh Troup. He was first cousins with William McIntosh, the guy who pocketed all the money from the state of Georgia. Now, this issue was the last thing that Adams wanted to deal with. Adams actually was pretty protective of Native American rights, but he had this really strange situation within his own mind in that he was protective of Native American rights and was not as blatantly prejudiced toward them as many were, but he also really believed in the idea of westward expansion, and he wanted to make sure he was at the forefront of encouraging and promoting the growth of the American economy and westward expansion and western land sales. So he was really stuck in a difficult spot. With the Creeks refusing to cede the land due to the circumstances, right, they were basically not acknowledging the treaty, Secretary of War James Barber recommended to Adams that they send federal troops to the South to stop Governor Troup from taking Creek land. And with Governor Troup declaring publicly that he wasn't going to back down and any blood spilled on Georgian soil would be Adams' fault, things were looking like they were going to get ugly. Adams didn't want a war. He didn't want to fight the state of Georgia, and he didn't want to fight the Creeks, so he began to look for a solution. Adams offered the Creeks a new treaty, This one would still have them feed land, but would promise them an equal amount of land in present-day Arkansas, along with $400,000 of payment. The Creek chiefs countered with some small adjustments to the land. They wanted to keep a little bit more so they could have access to certain waterways, and Adams and his men privately debated what to do next. Now, just to give you an idea of how emotional this issue was for many and what the perspective of some Americans were, Henry Clay, when debating what would be the best course in private, fumed about ideas of assimilation or negotiation, explaining that the Creeks were, quote, not an improvable breed, and their disappearance from the human family will be no great loss to the world. Wow. Ignoring Clay's enmity toward Native Americans, Adams was able to convince the Creeks to sign one treaty after another, slowly pushing them out of Georgia. But Governor Troup was not to be stopped. Before the natives had all left, he continued to send surveyors out to their land anyway, and unsurprisingly, these surveyors were arrested by the Creek. Now, you may be listening to this and thinking, what is the bigger picture here, Chris? Why are we going into such great detail over land negotiations in Georgia in 1825? Well, this was the first time that the United States had potential crisis looming that centered around the doctrine of nullification. As you know, the Constitution gave supremacy to the federal government over the states. Therefore, for example, if a state and federal act or law conflict, the federal law carries the day, technically. And you can understand why that would be the case. Without this, national unity would be much harder to achieve, almost impossible, it seems. From the perspective of the states, though, especially the southern states, the ones with slaves, of course, they did not agree. They were suspicious of the federal government, especially one run by a New Englander. The doctrine of nullification, which is something that will pick up more and more momentum as we move toward the Civil War, especially into Andrew Jackson's presidency, basically said that if a state were to deem a law unconstitutional, they didn't have to follow it. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds familiar. And if you're thinking that, you would be right. Because if you have a good memory, you may recall Thomas Jefferson and James Madison making the same such protest in the Virginia and Kentucky revolutions when fighting against the other President Adams' passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The logic behind this argument of doctrine of nullification, right, that states can nullify a federal law, and it sounds silly on the surface, but let's look one cut deeper. The logic behind it is that these states agreed to be governed by the federal government within the bounds of the Constitution. But if the federal government passes a law that is limiting or revoking the rights of the states, and the state believes it's unconstitutional, then the states don't have to follow it, right? And at this point, the Supreme Court still was not really relied upon for this type of active judicial review. I just want to point that out. Today, it's a bit different. In the mind of the states, this is a classic bait and switch. They get you to agree to one thing, and then they enforce another. And this is so important because as we move forward over the next 35 years, this is going to be the primary principle that southern states operate from and will cause them to really dig in their heels when things get tense between the North and the South. In the end, this issue between Georgia and the Creeks was eventually settled. Troup had the leverage, and he knew Adams wouldn't dare go to battle with one of his own states. Eventually, Adams backed away, and the Creeks left the remaining portions of the Georgia territory. As Adams entered his second year in office, he was determined to continue with his vision of using the federal government to support a broad program for internal improvements and infrastructure. Even though his cabinet thought it was a pretty bad idea, seeing how unpopular it would be outside the areas of the ardent Federalists in New England, Adams went forward with most of his original plan anyway. In his annual address to Congress, Adams added details to his inaugural address, laying out his plans. The efforts that would be made by Clay and Adams throughout the rest of his presidency became known as the American System, although Adams was much more bullish on some of the proposals than Clay. Adams proposed ideas for a national university, a naval academy, a ton of new roads, including one from New Orleans all the way to Washington, D.C., and the creation of the Department of the Interior to oversee all of this new progress. Now, it is important to note that a lot of these outside-the-box ideas failed spectacularly in Congress and never gained much momentum, but the agenda nonetheless showed Adams' commitment to doubling down on internal improvements. While at first blush, one would assume that there would likely be a lot of new taxes in order to complete this agenda, Adams and Clay were pushing so hard to act quickly on this stuff because they knew there was a huge boom on new Western land sales, and this was and would continue to be a large source of revenue for the federal government for the foreseeable future. With the expansion of more people and businesses to the West and the South, Clay and Adams believed it was critical to connect these somewhat disparate areas of the nation to spur new development and to increase trade, communication, and transportation. And while all of this sounded good, I'm sure you're not surprised by the reality that, wait for it, not everyone was on board with these plans. Many more conservative members believed that this liberal interpretation of the Constitution was not in line with the intention of the Founding Fathers and was a misguided interpretation of the General Welfare Clause that I mentioned earlier in the episode. Others didn't like the growing power of the federal government in general. I mean, this guy wants to build a new academy, create federal roads and canals, and use income from the land sales to put more power and resources into the federal government? To many, that was an uncomfortable proposition. They believed firmly in the concept of federalism that saw power and sovereignty split between the states and federal government, and this seemed like an intentional flaunting of that basic American principle. Lastly, many Southerners didn't like it for another reason, and not surprisingly, it had to do with, yep, you guessed it, slavery. Some in the South believed in a conspiracy theory that Adams was a closeted abolitionist. And while Adams was opposed to both the concept and system of African enslavement, there's little evidence that his national agenda was driven by such abolitionist desires. And it is important to note that over the next 35 years, there will continue to be a recurring fear of an existential crisis from the South every time a Northern politician is given power or authority. The long-term sustainability, both politically and socially, of the institution of slavery in the U.S. was on shaky ground, and many in the South knew it. They saw these internal improvements as an intentional effort to expand the power and authority of the federal government, and in turn, making the state governments, especially those in the South with less of a population, even less powerful in comparison. But even with all of the opposition to his plans and the recognition that many of them, like the creation of the Naval Academy, never came to fruition, Adams was still able to accomplish a lot during his presidency. Adams and his Army Corps of Engineers surveyed land for thousands of miles of potential roads. During his presidency, the National Road was extended from Cumberland, Maryland to Zanesville, Ohio, and numerous canals were either finished, rebuilt, or have started construction. And it is important to note that not all of these improvements were provided by and constructed by the government entirely. Many of these initiatives were taken up by private businesses. But the conditions for success were still made possible by the subsidies or land provided by the Adams administration. And it isn't a total surprise that John Quincy Adams was successful in some of his endeavors. He was well known for his incredible work ethic. The first one to wake and often the last to go to sleep as late even as midnight. He didn't take vacation. He stayed home in D.C. during the summer, which other presidents were like, oh, heck no, that place is like a swamp. It's so humid. And he took long walks and swims in the Potomac River. He worked so hard that it eventually began to wear on his cabinet, with men privately complaining of exhaustion from his breakneck pace. That being said, though, Adams' cabinet got along well and enjoyed each other's company, even though they often disagreed with each other on politics. But even with his incredible work ethic and his amicable cabinet working to try to keep up with him, John Quincy Adams will see his support wane over his time in office, especially in the South and the West. Simultaneously, Andrew Jackson was working to make sure he did everything in his power to put himself in a position to take advantage of and consolidate the growing opposition to Adams, so he could take the White House in 1828. And this is where we're going to stop for episode 115. I know it might be, I haven't checked the time, it might be a bit shorter than you're accustomed to, but we have a lot to cover next week as we look at the second half of Adams' presidency and the campaigning of Andrew Jackson for the election of 1828. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.